Deterrence theories of punishment justify punishment on the grounds that it's part of a practice that produces good consequences. Threats of punishment deter people from committing certain types of harmful acts, such as speeding, theft, vandalism, rape, and murder. Eliminate all legal penalties for a day, and what do you expect will happen? Threats of punishment also give people reasons to perform certain types of actions, to pay their taxes, for example, or to stop for pedestrians. Hsin-Wen Lee will argue that the traditional understanding of deterrence theory is flawed, and then she'll offer a suggestion for correcting it. For this, we begin by answering the question, what is this traditional deterrence theory? To help us understand traditional deterrence theory, Lee presents us with a classic comparison to traditional retributivist theories. According to deterrence theory, punishment has instrumental value. Its value depends on its being a useful instrument for realizing other ends or goals, such as preventing people from performing harmful or potentially harmful actions. This position stands in contrast to retributivism, which holds that punishment has intrinsic value because punishment gives offenders what they deserve, or what is required by standards of fairness. The standard form of deterrence theory that Lee will be criticizing is what she calls narrow scope theory. She calls it this because traditional deterrence theory looks at only one type of deterrence, external punishments and rewards. Note that she also calls this the shallow deterrence theory. In her words, quote, traditional theories have a narrow scope because the only tool of deterrence they can offer is fear of punishment, end quote. And it's because the narrow scope theory depends only on an agent's fear of punishment that she considers them to be what she calls shallow. So the city installs a new stoplight in front of a school. The reason for the stoplight is to get the cars on the street to stop from time to time so that the students can cross the street safely. How do you get people to stop? Well, installing the stoplight means that those who do not stop are going to get a ticket. They install the stoplight, they install a camera. Anybody who goes to the stoplight gets a $75 ticket. Voila, cars now stop at the red light and children can now cross the street safely. On narrow scope deterrence theory, all penalties are justified in this way, according to the direct effect that one's desire to avoid the penalty will have on behavior, and whether the change in behavior will produce a benefit to the community. Most people think that their children not being run over as they cross the street is a benefit to the community. Traditional deterrence theory looks pretty straightforward on the surface, but Lee will argue that there are some problems that emerge when we look at it in greater detail. These will be problems that wide-scope deterrence theory can fix. Looking at traditional deterrence theory in detail, Lee notes that it contains two key assumptions. The first of these she calls the capacity assumption. It's the assumption that people have the capacity to make rational decisions. People in the community can calculate the value of avoiding punishment and making their decisions as to what to do. This is how the desire to avoid punishment produces the effect of deterring people from performing the acts that will be punished. In the case of the new stoplight in front of the school, the driver includes the $75 fine as a part of the cost of going through the red light. When this cost is included, it makes it the case that it's not worthwhile to go through the red light. After all, a delay of 1 minute at $75 works out to, what, $4,500 an hour? Lee says, quote, this is how punishment deters crime. Without the capacity to consider and comprehend the consequences of one's actions, a person cannot be deterred by the threat of punishment, end quote. The second assumption is what she calls the deterrence assumption. This is the assumption that when people include the penalty in the cost of the action, they're less likely to perform the action. Note that we need both of these assumptions to explain how deterrence works. The fact that humans are rational agents must be combined with the rationality of choosing to avoid the punishment to produce deterrence. These two features working together make the use of punishment to prevent people from performing criminal acts reasonable. This is all pretty straightforward, and it may sound like Lee is belaboring the obvious, but it's sometimes useful to bring something out into the light so it can be looked at more closely. For deterrence theory, if a punishment doesn't make the type of activity being punished less common, then the punishment can't be justified. Lee wrote, quote, if a form of punishment did not deter crime, it has no deterrence value. Furthermore, if a form of punishment is likely to encourage more criminal offenses, then it has pro tanto negative value, end quote. So, throwing people in prison can be justified on deterrence grounds if it makes people less likely to perform those types of acts that put people in prison. But, she says, throwing people in prison has negative deterrence value when prison is a place where people can learn to perform criminal acts more successfully, when it becomes, in effect, a school of crime with other inmates as the teachers. Furthermore, when giving people a criminal record means that they can't get a job, and because they can't get a job, they turn to crime, then the system can't be justified on the basis of its deterrence value. It makes criminal acts more likely, not less likely. The notion that, according to deterrence theory, punishment must efficiently serve its end to be justified introduces what Lee calls a minimum rationality requirement. Lee writes, quote, "It is important to note that all deterrence theories must be limited by a minimal rationality requirement, given that punishment is regarded as a means to achieving some important objective. The use of a means must be justified as well as constrained by the end that it serves." End quote. For all practical purposes, what she means by this minimum rationality requirement is don't use a hammer to put in a screw, and don't use a screwdriver to drive in a nail. For punishment to be a useful tool, like a hammer or a screwdriver, it has to be able to serve its ends. To illustrate this principle, Lee looks at the effect of long prison sentences, which, she says, quote, "may force an offender to acclimate herself to the prison culture, thereby undermining her capacity to live a decent, normal life in the community." End quote. She adds, quote, "This effect of imprisonment might make criminal activities more desirable for her and may, for this reason, be detrimental to the community because instead of helping to reform and rehabilitate an offender, society helped to create a repeat offender." End quote. So, just as a quick summary, deterrence theory justifies punishment in terms of its usefulness as a tool or instrument in bringing about certain effects, such as bringing it about that people are less likely to commit criminal acts. A system of punishment where people learn more efficient ways to perform acts in prison, lose the ability to gain legal employment, and climatize people to the prison environment might not be the most effective way of deterring crime. As Lee mentioned above, there are a couple of requirements that must be met before punishment can deter crime. We have reason to look at conditions in which these requirements are not being met. For example, since deterrence theory requires that people be rational and are able to calculate the risks and costs of punishment in their deliberative decisions, deterrence theory can't work on those who are not in a rational frame of mind. Irrational agents lack a certain capacity to make rational decisions. This may be a long-term mental health issue or a short-term problem based on extreme emotions or intoxication or the like. Also, in order for punishment to deter somebody, the certainty and the severity of punishment must be high enough that it would convince a rational agent not to take the risk. An example where this criteria isn't met is the case where a company is fined $100,000 for an activity that brings in $20 million in profit. The fine in this case is not a deterrence. And the $75 fine for running a red light mentioned above provides an interesting test case. For the head of an impoverished household, $75 is a lot of money and may provide an effective deterrence. To somebody with an annual income of $100 million, it's run the red light and pay the bill when it comes in. By the way, to deal with this problem, in order to even out the deterrence value of speeding tickets, Switzerland proportions the ticket to the net worth of the driver. In 2010, an individual with a particularly high net worth was caught speeding, and when they fed their net value into the formula, the ticket turned out to be $290,000. Anyway, another type of case in which punishment might not provide sufficient deterrence is in the case of civil disobedience. Martin Luther King and his followers routinely violated the law. If the justification of a punishment is found in deterrence, the implication here is that the punishment for certain crimes should be increased so as to make civil disobedience not worth the cost. But we can question whether deterring civil disobedience actually justifies punishment. Another way in which punishment might not have a sufficiently high cost to deter crime comes from the fact that people in prison are guaranteed food, shelter, and medical care. If the conditions in prison are expected to be better than conditions outside of prison, And not because life in prison is so good, but because life outside of prison is so bad, this weakens the deterrence value of punishment. This implies that one way to increase the deterrence value of punishment isn't to make life in prison that much worse, but to make life outside of prison a little bit better. And finally, another set of factors that lowers the deterrence effect of punishment applies when people have little or nothing to lose because they have a terminal illness or they're particularly old. Though it's interesting to note, and this creates something of a problem for deterrence theory. People who are most likely to commit crimes are young males with a long life ahead of them. Those least likely to commit crimes are the elderly, where there's no possibility of punishment lasting more than a few years. In this, the first part of Lee's essay, Lee sought to provide us with an account of traditional deterrence theory, and in particular to highlight some of its weaknesses. What Lee called narrow-scope deterrence theories examines punishment based only on its effectiveness in producing external sanctions, sanctions that people impose on other people. Thus, the cause of the punishment is external to the person being punished. On the idea that we need to choose the correct tool for the job, and remember, the institution of punishment is a tool according to deterrence theory, we should expand the tool set so that it includes more than external sanctions. Lee proposed adding internal sanctions to our deterrence toolset, and I'll look at that suggestion in the next video.